The sun was setting as Joe Garcia wiped the thick grease from his hands with an old rag. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air of his small auto repair shop just outside Pine Valley. Joe had just turned 52 last month. His dark hair was now mostly gray, and his hands told the story of a lifetime fixing engines. Deep lines marked his face, weathered from years of hard work, but his eyes still held a spark when he talked about machines. "Time to close up," he muttered to himself, looking around the cluttered workshop. Tools hung neatly on the wall, a system only he understood. Old car parts and new ones sat organized in bins. This shop had been his life for nearly 30 years. Joe stepped outside to pull down the garage door, he noticed a faded blue car parked across the street. He recognized it right away. It belonged to Nancy Wu, who lived 3 houses down from him. She sat in the driver's seat looking tired. In the back seat was her daughter, Abby, an 8-year-old girl with big curious eyes and a shy smile. Joe waved politely and locked up his shop. He had known the Wu family for years, but they had grown distant after the terrible accident. 2 years ago, Nancy's husband Tom had been driving Abby home from her dance class when another car ran a red light. Tom didn't survive. Abby was left, paralyzed from the waist down. The whole neighborhood had brought food and offered help in those early days. But as weeks turned to months, people returned to their busy lives. Joe wasn't much for social visits, but he'd mow Nancy's lawn sometimes without mentioning it, or fix her car when it needed work, charging only for parts. Later that evening, as Joe sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he saw Nancy walking up his driveway. It was unusual. They rarely spoke beyond quick hellos. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair hastily tied back, but there was a determined look on her face. "Evening, Nancy," Joe said, standing up. "Everything okay with the car?" "The car's fine, Joe. It's about Abby," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "Can I sit for a minute?" Joe nodded, offering her the other chair. For a few moments they just sat in silence, listening to the crickets starting up their nightly songs. "Abby won't stop talking about flying," Nancy finally said, looking down at her hands. "Before the accident, Tom promised to take her up in an airplane for her 8th birthday. He was saving up for a small plane ride, a tourist thing." Joe nodded, remembering how Tom had always been full of big plans for his daughter. "She turned 8 last week," Nancy continued. "And now it's all she draws in her therapy sessions. Airplanes. Always airplanes." Her voice caught slightly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Joe. It was a child's drawing done in bright crayon colors. A simple airplane flying through puffy clouds with a stick figure looking out the window, a big smile on its face. "The doctors say she'll never walk again," Nancy said quietly, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I can handle that. We're figuring it out day by day, but I can't bear to tell her she might never fly either. It's the one thing keeping her spirits up." Joe looked at the drawing again. Something about it tugged at his heart. The simple joy of flight. He remembered feeling that same wonder as a kid building model airplanes with his father and dreaming of soaring through the clouds. "I don't know anyone who could take her up in a plane," Nancy said. "I've been saving, but with all the medical bills and the house modifications for her wheelchair." Joe's eyes moved from the drawing to his workshop across the street. For 40 years, he'd been taking things apart and putting them back together. Cars, motorcycles, boat engines, even the occasional lawnmower or tractor. His father had always told him, "If it's got moving parts, you can figure it out." A crazy idea started forming in his mind. He'd never built anything that flew before, but he'd read about ultralight aircraft and miniature planes. Some were just glorified go-karts with wings. If he could build a custom motorcycle from scratch last year. "Joe?" Nancy asked, noticing his distant expression. "Has Abby ever seen those little planes? The really small ones that look almost like big toys?" Joe asked, his mind racing through the possibilities. "I don't think so. Why?" Joe handed the drawing back to Nancy. "I've never built an airplane before," he said slowly, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "But I think I could build something small. Something safe that could give her the feeling of flying, even if just a few feet off the ground. "What are you saying?" Nancy asked, confusion mixed with a hint of hope crossing her face. "I'm saying maybe I could build something for Abby. Mini airplane. Something she could sit in even with her condition. Not a real plane that goes thousands of feet up, but something that could give her that feeling of flight she's dreaming about." Nancy stared at him, speechless. "I'm not promising anything," Joe quickly added. "I'd need to do a lot of research, figure out what's possible, what's safe. But why would you do that? It would take so much time, so much work." Joe looked back at the drawing, at the pure joy captured in those simple crayon lines. He thought about his empty evenings and weekends, the quiet house he returned to each night since his wife passed 5 years ago. He thought about the light that used to be in Abby's eyes before the accident, a light he'd seen dimming over the past 2 years. "Everyone needs something to look forward to," he said simply. "Abby needs to fly, and maybe I need to help her do it." Nancy covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Like I said, I'm not promising anything," Joe repeated. "But I'd like to try." As the last light of day faded from the sky, Joe Garcia made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He had no idea how to build an airplane, even a small one. He didn't know if it was even possible to make something safe enough, something that would work with Abby's condition. But looking at Nancy's hopeful face, at the drawing of an impossible dream, Joe felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond fixing what was broken. Maybe, just maybe, he could build something that would help a little girl soar again. The very next morning, Joe woke up earlier than usual. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an old notebook, sketching rough ideas of what a mini airplane might look like. He wasn't much of an artist, but he knew machines. By the time the sun was fully up, he had filled several pages with drawings and notes. After finishing his regular work at the shop that day, Joe stayed late, clearing a space in the corner of his garage. He pushed aside tool cabinets and rearranged shelves of auto parts. His mind was racing with questions. How big should it be? What kind of engine would be safe but strong enough? How could he make it work for someone who couldn't use their legs? That weekend, Joe drove 2 hours to the nearest small airport. He walked around, looking at the lightweight aircraft parked on the field, taking pictures with his old flip phone. A man in his 60s noticed him and walked over. "Looking to buy?" the man asked. "Just looking," Joe replied. "Actually, I'm thinking of building something small, like a miniature version of these." The man raised his eyebrows. "You a pilot?" "No, sir, mechanic, car mechanic." The man, who introduced himself as Frank, turned out to be a flight instructor with 40 years of experience. When Joe explained his idea for Abby, Frank's interest was immediately caught. "Crazy idea," Frank said, but he was smiling. "I like crazy ideas. Tell you what, come back next Saturday. I'll bring some books and plans that might help you." Over the next few weeks, Joe's evening routine changed completely. Instead of watching TV after dinner, he sat at his workbench reading books on aerodynamics and ultralight aircraft design. His kitchen table disappeared under printouts of technical specifications and diagrams. He even bought a computer, something he'd resisted for years, just so he could watch online videos of homemade aircraft. 1 month in, Joe's garage no longer looked like an auto repair shop. One wall was covered with detailed sketches. The floor space was marked with tape showing the dimensions of what he was planning to build. Lightweight aluminum tubes, aircraft grade, fabric, and special tools he'd never used before filled the space. His regular customers noticed the change. Old Pete, who came in every month for an oil change on his ancient pickup truck, peered curiously at the drawings on the wall. "You fixing planes now, Joe?" "Building one. A small one." Word spread quickly through Pine Valley. Joe had always been known as a good mechanic, but now he became something of a local curiosity. People would stop by just to see how the project was coming along. 6 weeks into the project, Joe hit his first major roadblock. The design he'd been working on required parts that were far too expensive, and some of the techniques were beyond his current skills. That evening, feeling defeated, he sat on his porch, He'd promised Nancy and Abby something he couldn't deliver. Just as he was considering how to break the news, a truck pulled up in front of his house. Out stepped Miguel, who taught engineering at the local high school. "Heard you're building a plane," Miguel said, walking up the driveway. "Got time for a chat?" That conversation changed everything. Miguel not only had experience with building model aircraft but offered to help. "And I've got students who'd love to work on a real project like this," he added. The next weekend, Joe's garage was filled with noise and energy as Miguel and 4 of his best students came over to help. They brought new ideas and enthusiasm that reignited Joe's determination. Nancy started bringing Abby to the workshop after school some days. At first, the little girl was quiet, just watching from her wheelchair. But soon she was asking questions, her eyes following every movement as the frame of the mini airplane slowly took shape. "Will I really get to sit in it?" she asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the plan," Joe said, showing her how he was designing the seat specially so it would be comfortable and secure for her. The project wasn't without problems. 3 months in, they discovered that the first engine they'd chosen wasn't going to work, too heavy for the frame they'd built. The wing design had to be scrapped and redone twice. Each setback cost time and money, but Joe refused to give up. Frank from the airport became a regular visitor, bringing old aircraft parts and giving advice. When he heard about the engine problem, he made some calls and found a lightweight motorcycle engine that could be modified. "Not powerful enough to get you to the moon," Frank joked with Abby, "but enough to give you some air under those wheels." The little girl's face lit up at those words, and Joe felt his determination strengthen. The late nights and endless problems were worth it for that look on her face. By month 5, the mini airplane was really taking shape. It looked like a cross between a go-kart and a small plane, with an open cockpit large enough for 2 people, sitting side by side, small wings, and a propeller at the front. They had designed it so the controls could all be operated by hand, with no need for foot pedals. One evening, after everyone had left, Nancy stayed behind to help Joe clean up. Abby had fallen asleep in her wheelchair, exhausted but happy after an afternoon of helping paint part of the wing. "It has to be perfect," Joe said quietly, looking at the sleeping child. "Not just safe. It has to be special. It has to give her something back, you know?" Nancy's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter, peaceful in sleep with a small smile on her face. "You already have," she whispered. "Look at her, Joe. I haven't seen her this excited about anything since before the accident. This isn't just about flying anymore. It's about hope." Joe nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in his throat. What had started as a crazy idea, a simple gesture to help a child's dream come true, had grown into something that was changing all their lives, and they weren't even done yet. As the mini airplane neared completion, strange things started happening around Joe's workshop. He first noticed it on a Tuesday morning, a black car he didn't recognize driving slowly past his garage. The driver, a man in a suit, seemed to be taking pictures with his phone. 2 days later, a well-dressed woman came into the shop asking detailed questions about the airplane project. She claimed to be a local reporter doing a story on community heroes. But something about her felt off to Joe. She was particularly interested in the modifications he'd made to accommodate Abby's condition. "How did you solve the control problem for someone without the use of their legs?" she asked, scribbling notes in a small leather notebook. Joe gave vague answers, suddenly protective of his creation. After the woman left, he called the local newspaper. They had no reporter working on such a story. The following week, packages began arriving at the workshop, materials Joe had researched but couldn't afford. The first was a box of specialized lightweight controls, perfect for someone who needed to operate everything by hand. There was no return address, just a note that read, "For the Flying Dream." "Did you order these?" Miguel asked when he saw the package. Joe shook his head. "Never seen them before, and I definitely couldn't afford them." They inspected the parts carefully before using them, concerned they might be defective, but everything was top quality. Professional-grade equipment that would normally be used in real aircraft. More deliveries followed. Special composite materials, A custom-made seat with safety features ideal for Abby's needs, even an improved engine component that solved a problem they'd been struggling with for weeks. "Someone's watching us," Joe told Nancy one evening as they sat outside the workshop. "And whoever it is knows a lot about what we're doing." Nancy looked worried. "Should we be concerned? Is Abby in any danger?" Joe shook his head. "I don't think so. These parts, they're making the plane better, safer. It's almost like someone wants to help but doesn't want to show their face." Late one night, as Joe was working alone in the shop, Nancy called. "There's someone outside your place," she said, her voice tense. "I was putting out trash and saw a man with a camera taking pictures of your workshop. When I called out asking what he was doing, he jumped in his car and drove off." The next day, Joe installed security cameras around his property. Nothing fancy, just basic cameras that would record anyone coming near the workshop. Within days, they captured images of men with professional-looking equipment photographing the airplane from various angles. They never attempted to enter the garage, just documented the project from outside. Joe took the footage to Chief Rivera at the local police station. The chief watched the videos with a frown, but his response was oddly dismissive. "Probably just aviation enthusiasts," he suggested. "Word gets around about unusual projects like yours." But his eyes didn't meet Joe's, and his usual friendly manner seemed forced. As Joe was leaving the station, Officer Danny, a young cop who had helped with some of the metal work on the airplane, caught up with him in the parking lot. "Chief's acting weird about this," Danny said quietly. "Got a call from someone big last week asking about your project. Wouldn't say who they were, just that we shouldn't interfere with anyone observing it." "Government?" Joe asked. Danny shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe some big aviation company. Whoever it was, they've got the chief spooked." The mystery deepened when Miguel reported that someone had been asking questions at the high school about the students who were helping with the project. "They had ID, but it didn't look like regular press credentials," Miguel said. "Principal talked to them for an hour in his office, then told me to keep up the good work with the airplane project. He seemed impressed, maybe a little nervous." Airplane was nearly finished when Joe received an official-looking letter in the mail. It requested that he postpone any test flights pending review of proper permits and authorizations. There was no agency letterhead, just a phone number that, when Joe called it, connected to a generic voicemail. Frank from the airport took one look at the letter and snorted. "Bureaucratic nonsense for something this small on private property. You don't need half the permits they're talking about." But there was a tension in Frank's voice that made Joe suspicious. "You know something," Joe said. "What aren't you telling?" "Me?" Frank sighed heavily. "Got a visit last week. 2 men, very official, asking about your project. Wanted to know when you were planning the first flight. And I got the feeling they didn't want it to happen until they were ready." Frank lowered his voice. "One of them slipped and mentioned something about a program and official documentation. When I pressed, they backed off, said they were just concerned about safety regulations." That evening, Joe, Nancy, Frank, and Miguel gathered in the workshop after the others had left. The nearly completed mini airplane sat gleaming under the lights, its bright blue paint, Abby's favorite color, still fresh in places. "Someone doesn't want us to fly," Joe said, showing them the letter. "Or someone wants to control when we do." "But why?" Nancy asked. "It's just a small plane for a little girl. We're not breaking any laws." Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Maybe we've created something more important than we realized. These modifications for Abby, they're pretty innovative. Could be valuable to someone." Miguel nodded slowly. "My cousin works for a medical equipment company. Says there's big money in adaptive technology for people with disabilities. Maybe that's what this is about." "So what do we do?" Nancy asked, looking at the airplane that represented so much hope for her daughter. Joe thought for a long moment, his eyes on the special controls they'd designed for Abby's hands, the safety system that would secure her body while giving her freedom. "We fly anyway," he said finally. "But not when they expect us to." The group leaned in closer as Joe outlined his plan. They would tell everyone they were planning the first flight for next Saturday. Plenty of time for inspections and paperwork. Meanwhile, they would prepare for a secret dawn flight 3 days earlier. It was always Abby's dream, Joe said firmly. Not anyone else's. She flies first before whoever these people are can take over. As they finalized their plans, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on Joe's new security camera, or that it had briefly gone dark during their entire conversation. The alarm on Joe's phone buzzed softly at 3:30 in the morning. He'd barely slept anyway, his mind racing with final checks and safety procedures. Outside, the world was still dark and quiet as he dressed quickly in warm clothes. Today was the day. Abby's first flight. Yesterday, they had loaded the mini airplane onto Miguel's flatbed trailer and covered it completely with tarps, making it look like construction materials. They'd driven it to Frank's cousin's farm outside town, a perfect spot with a long, flat field and no neighbors for miles. Joe's truck lights cut through the darkness as he drove down empty streets. He picked up Frank first, then Miguel. No one spoke much, a mixture of nervousness and excitement keeping them quiet. When they arrived at Nancy's house, she was already waiting on the porch with Abby bundled up in blankets. "Ready for an adventure?" Joe asked softly as he helped load Abby's wheelchair into the back of his truck. The little girl nodded, her eyes bright despite the early hour. "Is it really happening today? Really, truly?" "Really, truly," Joe promised. "If the weather holds." The small convoy, Joe's truck and Miguel's covered trailer, moved carefully through the sleeping town and out onto country roads. Joe kept checking his rearview mirror, but no headlights appeared behind them. So far, their plan was working. They reached the farm just as the eastern sky began showing the first hint of gray. Miguel and Frank immediately went to work uncovering the airplane and making final preparations. Joe set up portable lights so they could see what they were doing in the pre-dawn darkness. Nancy helped Abby with her special flight jacket, a gift from the students who had worked on the project. They had painted her name on the back along with small wings. Underneath, she wore a safety harness they had practiced with many times. "How are you feeling?" Nancy asked, adjusting the jacket's collar. "Not scared," Abby said firmly, then hesitated. "Well, maybe a little scared, but the good kind like Christmas Eve." Joe went through his checklist one final time. The mini airplane wasn't meant to go high or fast. It was designed to give Abby the experience of flight while staying close to the ground. It could hold 2 people. Joe would pilot while Abby rode in the specially designed passenger seat beside him. "Weather conditions?" Joe asked Frank, who had been monitoring a portable weather station. "Perfect," Frank replied. "Light wind from the east, clear visibility, should be getting better as the sun comes up." "Engine?" Miguel gave a thumbs up. "Running smooth, all systems check out." Joe turned to Nancy, who stood holding Abby's hand. "It's your call," he said quietly. "We don't have to do this today, we can wait." Nancy looked down at her daughter's expectant face, then back at Joe. "We're ready," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. The next 20 minutes were a flurry of activity. Joe and Miguel carefully lifted Abby from her wheelchair and secured her in the passenger seat of the mini airplane. They checked and double-checked the special harness system, making sure she was completely safe but comfortable. Joe showed her again how the communication system worked. Simple headsets that would allow them to talk to each other over the yaw engine noise. He reminded her about the special camera mounted on the wing that would record their flight. "Remember, we're staying low and slow," Joe explained as he took his seat beside her. "If you feel scared or uncomfortable at any point, you just tell me, and we'll come back down right away." Abby nodded, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. Her face was a mixture of excitement and determination. As the first golden rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Frank and Miguel stepped away from the aircraft. Nancy came forward for one last hug with Abby, then joined the others at a safe distance. Joe started the engine and the mini airplane hummed to life, vibrating gently. The propeller spun, catching the morning light. He checked all the gauges and controls one last time, then looked at Abby. "Ready for takeoff, co-pilot?" he asked through the headset. Abby's face broke into a wide smile. "I've been ready my whole life," she answered, her voice steady and clear. Joe taxied the aircraft slowly across the field, feeling the wheels move over the grass. The control stick was responsive in his hands, All those months of work, all those late nights and problems solved, had led to this moment. At the far end of the field, he turned the airplane to face the long stretch of open space ahead of them. The rising sun painted the sky in beautiful shades of pink and gold. "Here we go," Joe said, easing the throttle forward. The mini airplane picked up speed, bumping slightly on the uneven ground. Joe kept his eyes fixed ahead, occasionally glancing at the instruments. Beside him, Abby was completely silent, her eyes wide. The bumping suddenly smoothed out, and there was a new sensation, a lightness, a freedom. Joe felt the moment the wheels left the ground, felt the aircraft lift into the air. "We're flying," Abby shouted into her headset. "Joe, we're really flying." Joe couldn't help grinning as he kept the aircraft climbing gently. They weren't going very high, just enough to clear the trees at the edge of the field. But they were definitely airborne. The morning air was smooth and clear as they flew a slow circuit around the farm. Below them, Miguel, Frank, and Nancy were waving, their figures growing smaller. Joe heard something through his headset that made his heart swell. Abby's laughter, pure and unrestrained, the sound of a child experiencing joy without limits. "Look, over there," Joe said, pointing to where the sun was throwing golden light across the landscape. "Everything looks different from up here, doesn't it?" "It's like the whole world is new," Abby replied, her voice filled with wonder. For 40 perfect minutes they soared above the countryside. Joe pointed out landmarks: the river that ran through town, the high school where Miguel taught, the highway that led to the city. Abby operated the small camera as they had practiced, taking pictures of their journey. When Joe finally brought the airplane in for a gentle landing, touching down softly on the grassy field, Abby turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "That was better than anything I ever dreamed." As Joe helped her back into her wheelchair, Nancy rushed forward, her own eyes wet with tears. Miguel and Frank were close behind, everyone talking at once, asking how it felt what they saw. Abby couldn't stop smiling. "I wasn't just a girl in a wheelchair up there," she told her mother. "I was a pilot, Mom. I was free." Joe stood back, watching the excitement, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. After all the work, all the questions and mysterious observers, they had done it. They had given Abby her dream. Whatever happened next, no one could take this moment away from her. As they packed up to leave, Miguel pointed to the eastern sky. "Looks like we've got company," he said quietly. In the distance, coming from the direction of town, a line of dark vehicles was moving down the country road toward the farm. "We need to pack up, fast," Frank said, watching the approaching vehicles. But Joe shook his head. "No time. They'll be here before we can load everything." He looked at the mini airplane still sitting in the field, gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Besides, we haven't done anything wrong." There were 7 vehicles in total, large black SUVs with tinted windows. They pulled up in a neat line at the edge of the field, and for a moment, no one got out. Joe stood protectively near Abby's wheelchair, while Nancy placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Finally, the doors of the vehicles opened. Men and women in dark suits stepped out, along with several people in what looked like military uniforms. A tall man in a gray suit approached them first. "Mr. Garcia?" he said, extending his hand to Joe. "I'm Director Paul Wilson with the Federal Aviation Administration's Special Projects Division." Joe cautiously shook the man's hand. "You're the ones who've been watching us." Director Wilson nodded. "We've been monitoring your project for some time now." "How did you find us today?" Miguel asked. "We didn't tell anyone about this location." A slight smile crossed Wilson's face. "The delivery van that brought those special controls to your workshop last month? One of ours. We included a small tracking device in the packaging." Joe felt a flash of anger. "You had no right to spy on us. This was a private project." "Actually, Mr. Garcia, what you've built here is of significant interest to the government," Wilson replied. "May I?" He gestured toward the mini airplane. Without waiting for an answer, he walked over to inspect it. Several people in uniforms followed him, taking pictures and making notes on tablets. "What's happening, Joe?" Abby asked, her voice small and worried. Before Joe could answer, there was movement among the vehicles. From the last SUV, a woman emerged. Unlike the others in suits, she was in a wheelchair, sleek and modern, but unmistakably a wheelchair. She was in her 40s with short dark hair and an air of authority. She wheeled herself toward the group. Dr. Helen Torres, Wilson introduced her, Director of the National Aeronautics and Mobility Initiative. Dr. Torres wheeled directly to Abby. "Hello, Abby," she said warmly. "I hear you just had your first flight." Abby nodded, still confused but responding to the woman's friendly tone. Dr. Torres turned to Joe. "Mr. Garcia, for 3 years, our team of aerospace engineers and medical specialists has been attempting to design adaptive aircraft for individuals with mobility impairments. We've spent millions in funding and used state-of-the-art facilities." She gestured toward the mini airplane. "Then we heard about a small-town mechanic building something in his garage that our experts couldn't achieve in laboratories." The group fell silent as Dr. Torres continued. "We began monitoring your progress, hoping to learn what our teams were missing." She wheeled closer to the mini airplane, running her hand along its side. "Your design is remarkable in its simplicity. The control systems, the safety harness, they're innovative but accessible. And most importantly, they work." Joe was stunned. "You're saying all this attention, all the mysterious deliveries and surveillance, it was because the government couldn't figure out how to build something like this?" Wilson stepped forward. "Sometimes the best innovations don't come from labs and billion-dollar budgets, Mr. Garcia. They come from people solving real problems for those they care about." By now, more people had exited the vehicles. Among them were several families, some with children in wheelchairs. They stood at the edge of the field, watching with obvious interest. "What exactly do you want from us?" Nancy asked, still protective. "Dr." Torres smiled. "We want to offer Mr. Garcia a grant to develop this further, to refine the design and make it available to more people like Abby, and like me." She looked at Abby. "There are thousands of children and adults who dream of experiencing flight just as you did today." Joe looked back at the mini airplane, then at the families watching from a distance. He thought about all the problems they'd solved, all the late nights. "I didn't build it to be revolutionary," he said slowly. "I built it because a little girl needed to fly." "And that's exactly why it works," Dr. Torres replied. "The best innovations come from love, not laboratories. Our engineers thought they needed to reinvent flight. You understood that you just needed to adapt it." The rest of the morning was a blur of introductions and explanations. The families at the edge of the field came forward. They were part of a support group for children with mobility impairments, invited by Dr. Torres to see the first successful adaptive aircraft in action. Soon, Abby was surrounded by other kids excitedly telling them about her flight, showing them the pictures she had taken from the air. Parents asked Joe endless questions, their faces full of hope that their children might one day experience the same freedom Abby had found. Dr. Torres explained that the grant would allow Joe to continue working on the design while maintaining control of the project. "We don't want to take this over," she assured him. "We want to support what you've already created." As the morning turned to afternoon, Joe found himself sitting with Frank, watching as Miguel showed a group of children the special controls inside the mini airplane. "Still think they're the bad guys?" Frank asked with a grin. Joe shook his head. "No, but they could have just knocked on my door and asked to help instead of all the cloak and dagger stuff." Frank laughed. "Government types. They can't help themselves." In the middle of it all, Nancy found a moment to sit beside Joe. They watched as Abby, still in her flight jacket, showed another girl in a wheelchair the pictures on the camera. Both children were smiling, animated in their conversation. "Thank you," Nancy said softly. "Not just for the flight, but for everything. I haven't seen her this happy, this normal, since before the accident." Joe nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Turns out we built more than just an airplane." As the afternoon sun shone down on the field, Dr. Torres approached Joe again. "We'd like to schedule a formal demonstration next month. Bring in some engineers, some healthcare specialists. Would that be all right with you?" Joe looked out at the field where his creation sat gleaming in the sunlight. Beyond it, the line of black SUVs no longer seemed menacing but full of possibility. He watched Abby showing another child how the control system worked, her face alive with confidence and joy. On one condition, Joe said, Abby is the test pilot. It's her airplane first, before it belongs to anyone else. Dr. Torres smiled and extended her hand. I wouldn't have it any other way. The mechanic who had only wanted to build one dream had, without intending to, created wings for many. And as Joe looked around at all the hopeful faces surrounding his creation, he realized that this was just the beginning of their flight.